They called it the Beast of the Borderlands. First, it was tales whispered at the far edges of the settlement. Cattle torn clean in two, a sheepdog found nothing but bloody fur, and prints in the muck that chilled the heart of any woodsman. Some scoffed, citing wolves, or maybe that big cat folks swore they'd spotted further north. I held my tongue, knowing the shape of such tracks better than most, and there ain't no wolf nor mountain lion that could do such things. I'm a hunter by trade, and a tracker by nature. Name's Jonah Mason. The woods are my church, the track marks my scripture, and the creatures of the wild my congregation. My pa, he taught me all I know. Reading the whispers of the earth was how he put venison on the table, and how he met his end out there in the green vastness. I ain't the religious sort, but sometimes I think he's still watching, guiding my eyes to what others miss. They came to me, the men of the town. Alderman Shaw with his fancy breeches and too much belly, Cooper Ben with his old musket that was more bark than bite, and young Tom Ellis with a fire in his eye that didn't quite match his shaky grip on that rifle. "Jonah Mason," Shaw puffed out, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow. "The selectmen have need of your skills." "Is that right?" I spit a wad of chaw into the dust. "Don't seem to recall any of you offering a helping hand when my roof near caved in last winter." Ellis had the decency to flush red, but the alderman just puffed up more. "This concerns the safety of all, boy. Your petty grievances hold no weight." "Whatever it is, it'll cost you," I told them. Necessity bred cooperation, even with the likes of Shaw. The haggling was easier than I imagined. Turns out, fear opens purses quicker than generosity. We struck a deal, and by noon I was shouldering my pack, an old flintlock. Venturing beyond the worn paths and meager fields into the true borderlands. It was there I found it, not the beast itself, but the place where the world seemed to fray. Old trees twisted unnaturally, their branches forming skeletal claws. The bird's song, lively near the settlement, fell into an eerie silence the deeper I went. And the tracks, gods, the tracks, they were something out of nightmares. A wolf, aye, but with paws the size of a man's hand and stride no earthly creature should manage. My heart thrummed a desperate rhythm against my ribs. I'm not a fool, but I'm not a coward neither. I followed that trail with a hunter's instinct, the kind that thrums in the back of your mind, both caution and thrill battling for dominance. It led to a clearing, bathed in the sickly sweet light of a late afternoon sun. And there, amidst the carnage of a half-devoured doe, it stood. Words fail me now when I try to conjure it up. A wolf, in the loosest sense, but warped and monstrous. The size of a bear it was, coated in fur like bristled wire, and eyes, by the Lord above, eyes that gleamed a wicked yellow under that sinking sun. It raised its bloodied head, and a guttural rumble echoed in the clearing, half growl, half something I couldn't fathom. My flintlock was up and aimed before reason kicked in. Muscle memory and the chill of true fear guided my hand. The shot roared out, echoing in the deathly still woods. The creature lurched, a pained snarl tearing from its throat, not falling, but turning with impossible speed. Yellow eyes fixed on me. Time. It seemed to bend like a twig. I fumbled for powder, hands gone clumsy with panic. Another blink, and the thing wasn't there. Just a smear of monstrous form disappearing into the trees. I stumbled back, tripped over a root, and found myself sprawled ignominiously on the ground. The clearing was empty, save for the doe's ruined carcass. The sun, I realized, had already slipped below the horizon. With shaking hands, I reloaded. And then, I ran. The word spread as wildfire does, swift and merciless. By the time I staggered back into the settlement, lanterns bobbed in the windows, and the smell of wood smoke and fear clung heavy in the air. There was a meeting in the town hall, the one place big enough for everyone to cram in and heat up their voices like stew on a simmer. Alderman Shaw all but shoved me into a chair at the front, my account of the clearing and its beastly tenant the main course, Folks whispered, some casting fearful glances in my direction as if I'd already started to sprout fur and fangs. "Yellow eyes, you say?" Cooper Ben rasped, his musket resting nervously across his knees. "The devil's own mark." "What in God's name was that thing?" Mary Ellis whimpered, clutching her Tom close. That fire in his eyes had cooled to a spark of frightened despair. I sat there amidst the clamor, the weight of their gazes stifling as a burlap sack. Words swirled around me. Witchcraft, devils, the wrath of a vengeful god. But they felt distant. My mind still caught on the image of those eyes and the inhuman speed of that monstrous form. They formed a hunting party then. A ragged band of farmers and shopkeepers, their fear hardening into a brittle sort of resolve. Shaw, of course, insisted on leading the charge, with Cooper Ben puffing alongside, musket gripped so tight his knuckles were white. Tom Ellis was there too, the rifle oversized in his hands, but a stubborn set to his jaw. I led them back along the trail, my hunter's senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaf, every snapped twig, had me whirling, flintlock leveled. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. When we reached the clearing, a collective gasp sliced the air. The doe was gone. Only a smear of blood on the trampled grass remained. Tracks, those infernal wolf prints, trailed off into the shadows. But the creature, the beast, was nowhere to be seen. "It's watching us," a voice hissed, barely louder than a breeze, but carrying a shiver of fear nonetheless. "Lurkin', it is." We stood in that oppressive clearing, the sun a faint glow above, the trees tight sentinels holding us in their gaze. Each man shifted nervously, fingers itching on triggers. The shadows seemed to creep closer, the silence broken only by the thudding of my own heart. Now a drummer gone rogue. Then, a twig snapped. Chaos erupted. A shot rang, the echo whipping through trees. Cries of alarm turned to panicked shouts. In the confusion, Cooper Ben tripped, the musket firing wildly into the sky. He cursed, fumbled to reload, while Shaw bellowed for order. Through it all, I stood rooted. My eyes not on the men, but on the trees where that cracking sound had come from. The woods watched back. Nothing moved, nothing showed itself. Yet that feeling, like eyes on my skin, it lingered. As dusk painted the sky in bruises, the hunting party retreated, tails between their legs. Shaw grumbled about false alarms. Tom Ellis's shoulders slumped, but their fear was a tangible thing, clinging like sweat. Me. I was a walking coil of tension, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Walking back, the trees seemed closer, branches snaking lower, and with every rustle, every shadow, I swore I saw those glinting yellow eyes in the gathering gloom. By the time the first stars poked through the inky blackness, I was half convinced the thing was stalking us, biding its time. We reached the settlement, torches blazing at the outskirts to ward off the all-consuming darkness. I didn't feel safe till I was behind my own door, the flimsy latch and worn flintlock laughable shields against the horrors lurking beyond. Sleep was a fitful, fleeting thing. Each creak of the floorboards, each howl of a distant coyote had me jolting awake, heart pounding. In those hazy moments, between waking and nightmare, I saw the clearing bathed in moonlight, the monstrous wolf form emerging from the shadows, and those terrible yellow eyes fixed squarely on me. The full moon hung heavy in the sky, a malevolent eye staring down at the restless town. Sleep was a stranger for everyone that night. Fear a tangible fog clinging to the wooden houses. I tossed and turned in my cot, the thin blanket offering scant comfort against the chill that seemed to seep from the very boards beneath me. Every creak of settling timber, every rustle of wind against the window pane sent a jolt of terror through me. The full moon had always stirred the wild things, but tonight it felt different. A primal unease gnawed at my gut, a primal fear that resonated deep within my bones. Sleep finally claimed me, a fitful, fevered thing filled with nightmares of snarling beasts and glowing yellow eyes. A strangled gasp ripped me from my dreams. I sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering against my ribs like a frantic trapped bird. The sound echoed again, closer this time, laced with a whimper of pain. It came from the house next door, Old Man Henderson's place. Hesitation battled with a gnawing sense of responsibility. Finally, fueled by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need to distract myself from my own mounting terror, I threw on my breeches and grabbed my flintlock. Moonlight painted the streets in an eerie silver glow. The night was silent, the usual symphony of crickets and frogs hushed into an unnatural stillness. The air itself held a metallic tang, heavy and oppressive. Henderson's cabin stood silhouetted against the moonlit sky, a single dim candle flickering in the window. I approached cautiously, boots crunching lightly on the frost-dusted ground. The window panes rattled violently, then a sickening thud echoed from within. Panic clawed at my throat. I flung open the rickety door, the stench of something foul and feral washing over me. The single candle sputtered and died, plunging the small room into darkness. My heart hammered a frantic tattoo against my ribs. "Mr. Henderson?" I called out, my voice hoarse with fear. Silence answered back, thick and suffocating. A low growl, guttural and primal, vibrated through the floorboards. My skin crawled, a primal terror gripping me tighter than a bear trap. I fumbled for a flint and tinder, the sparks a pitiful excuse for light in the inky blackness. The growling intensified, accompanied by the sound of ragged breathing, wet and heavy. Finally, the fire in the hearth sputtered to life, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. The sight that greeted me turned my blood to ice. Old Man Henderson was gone. On the floor, a pool of crimson stained the rough-hewn wooden boards. In the center of the pool lay a monstrous hand, impossibly large, knuckles gnarled and thick, tipped with long, wicked claws. It pulsed with a sickly yellow light, mirroring the malevolent moon outside. A monstrous transformation was unfolding before me. The stuff of nightmares made terrifyingly real. Bones cracked and shifted with sickening pops, muscles bulged and contorted, ripping through the fabric of Henderson's nightshirt. A guttural scream, unlike any human sound, tore from the twisted form on the floor. The creature rose on hind legs, dwarfing the meager cabin. Its fur, once a neat salt and pepper, now sprouted thick and matted, the color of a moonless night. Its face, no longer human, was stretched into a grotesque parody, a muzzle filled with needle-like teeth that glinted with a feral hunger. The yellow eyes, once cloudy with age, now burned with a malevolent intelligence that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing against me. It turned its head, those dreadful eyes locking onto mine. A low growl rumbled from its throat, a sound that promised pain and oblivion. In that frozen moment, I saw a reflection of myself, my own primal fear mirrored back in its monstrous gaze. Then, in a flash of monstrous speed, it was upon me. My scream died somewhere between my clenched teeth and the thick, fetid air of Henderson's cabin. The monstrous wolf creature, a grotesque parody of the man I knew, loomed over me. Spittle flecked its muzzle as it snarled, the yellow glow from its eyes pinning me like a moth to a flame. Time seemed to distort, the air thick with the stench of decay and raw power. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a loose floorboard, sending me sprawling onto the cold, blood-slicked floor. The creature's head snapped down, the reeking maw snapping inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a sound like ripping canvas. My eyes flew open, and I stared in horrified fascination as the creature's ragged nightshirt shredded under the pressure of its growing form. Muscles bunched and writhed beneath its pale, scarred skin. Bones shifted audibly, popping and cracking like dry twigs underfoot. A sickening, wet sound filled the air as flesh stretched and tore, revealing glistening red muscle beneath. The creature roared, a sound that shook the very timbers of the cabin and vibrated through my bones like a tuning fork on high pitch. The transformation was a horrifying symphony of violence. Fur, thick and matted the color of a moonless night, erupted from every pore on Henderson's once human body. His fingers, gnarled and calloused with age, contorted and elongated, splitting at the tips to reveal wicked, black claws. I saw, with a horrifying clarity, the bone elongate and reshape, forming the deadly tips of those monstrous talons. The creature's chest heaved, its back hunching as its spine stretched and deformed. Ribs protruded, resembling the cage of some monstrous beast. Its head, once lined with the wrinkles of a long life, stretched and reshaped, the human features melting away into a grotesque muzzle. Its eyes, the most horrifying feature of all, seemed to grow larger within that shifting skull. The once pale blue irises were now burning embers, filled with a feral intelligence that chilled me to the core. There was no recognition there, no flicker of the old Henderson I vaguely remembered, only a primal hunger and an almost chilling amusement at my terror. Finally, with a bone-jarring crunch, the transformation seemed to reach its apex. The creature stood on its hind legs, easily dwarfing the meager cabin. Its body, once frail and stooped, was now a hulking mass of muscle and bone. It turned its massive head, and those burning yellow eyes locked onto mine. For a heartbeat, we stood there, predator and prey locked in a silent dance of terror. Then, with a deafening roar that sent a shiver down my spine, the beast lunged. Adrenaline surged through my veins, yanking me from my paralysis. I scrambled backwards, the slick floorboard sending me sprawling. The creature's massive paw slammed through the space where my head had been a moment before, splintering a table in half. I rolled, desperate and fueled by sheer terror, coming up against the wall. The beast whirled, its yellow eyes tracking my every move. It stalked closer, a predator savoring its prey. Every snarl, every growl vibrated through the air, resonating in my very bones. The cabin was small, offering little room for escape. Panic gnawed at the edges of my sanity. My hand brushed against the cold metal of my flintlock, a sliver of hope sparking in the pit of my despair. I lunged for it, fingers fumbling with the worn leather. The creature was upon me again, its fetid breath washing over me. I squeezed my eyes shut, aimed the flintlock at the beast's chest, and pulled the trigger. A deafening roar filled the cabin. The flash of the flintlock momentarily blinded me, the smell of burnt gunpowder stinging my nostrils. I peeked open one eye, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The creature stood there, a cloud of acrid smoke swirling around its hulking form. A single point of red stained its chest fur, but it seemed barely phased. It let out a frustrated snarl, its yellow eyes blazing with renewed fury. There was no time for a second shot. The beast lunged, its massive claws reaching for me. In a desperate move, I threw the flintlock at its head, the empty gun clattering harmlessly to the floor. The creature blinked in momentary surprise, then roared in outrage. That momentary hesitation was all I needed. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, I scrambled past the beast, slamming into the cabin door. It splintered under the force of my body, sending me tumbling out into the cold night air. I scrambled away from the cabin, feet slipping on the frozen ground. Behind me, the enraged beast tore through the shattered remains of the door, its howls echoing in the night. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled into the center of the settlement. "Help!" My cry was a rasp of terror, swallowed by the uncanny stillness that gripped the town. "Mercy, help me!" It was as if the entire town held its breath. Windows remained darkened, doors tightly barred, and from that fearful silence sprouted the seeds of my own panic. Fear, it turns out, is far more contagious than any plague. Finally, a window creaked open, a single flickering candle illuminating the worried face of Mrs. Parker. The relief was quickly overcome by horror as she took in my appearance. Wild-eyed, clothes torn, a streak of blood across my face. "Jonah Mason!" she gasped. "What in heaven's name—" "Monsters!" I cut her off, voice strained with urgency. "There are monsters. Henderson, he—" My frantic explanation barely formed words before a scream shattered the night. It came from the direction of the town square, rising above the low murmur of alarmed voices that was just taking hold. A flicker of orange light cut through the darkness, then another, and another. Mrs. Parker and I exchanged a look of dread. Before a single thought could be pieced together, we were running, drawn by the chaos of screams and the growing glow on the horizon. The silence had shattered as the town erupted in a frenzy of fear. By the time we reached the square, the scene was pure bedlam. Figures, silhouetted by flames, dashed in all directions. Up ahead, Shaw's general store was ablaze, and I could make out Cooper Ben frantically dousing the flames with buckets of water. A tangle of bodies thrashed on the ground, then a chilling howl cut through the air, and the figures scattered like ants. I saw Tom Ellis clutching his side, his face contorted in pain. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm as I searched for something, anything familiar in the chaos. A shadow, large and grotesque, flickered at the edge of the inferno. Yellow eyes gleamed within. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The monster from Henderson's cabin wasn't an isolated terror. I staggered back, bumping into Mrs. Parker, who let out a frightened squeak. "How many—" I choked out the question, dreading the answer. "I don't know," she whimpered, clutching her shawl against the biting cold. "There's more, Jonah. I saw them in the shadows." Terror had burrowed into the hearts of the townsfolk, transforming once familiar faces into masks of fear. People pushed and shoved each other, their screams a discordant chorus above the crackling flames. The stench of burning wood and something foul, something feral, hung thick in the air. It was then a new sound pierced the night. A gunshot, echoing sharply. My head whipped around, and through the haze of fire and panic, I saw Alderman Shaw standing atop a porch, his face pale. Another gunshot rang out. He was firing wildly into the crowd, screaming something about order, something about fighting back. A fresh wave of panic swept through the remaining townsfolk. This wasn't just a fight for survival against unseen monsters anymore. It was the disintegration of everything held as common ground. The very fabric of the town was fraying. I saw them everywhere. Hulking shadows with glowing eyes, moving with unnatural speed amidst the disarray. They stalked the terrified townsfolk, their snarls and growls adding to the cacophony of terror. The settlement I had known, a place of simple routine and cautious civility, was now a war zone, a monstrous hunting ground bathed in firelight. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee into the encroaching darkness and pray the monsters didn't find me. But I wasn't just Jonah Mason anymore. I was the hunter who knew their tracks, who'd seen them up close. My fear wasn't a paralysis, it was a burning coal, the very thing that might give us a sliver of hope amidst the encroaching chaos. In the swirling chaos of that burning night, with the screams, the fear, and the sharp tang of blood in the air, something shifted inside of me. I could have been just another broken body amidst the terror, another victim claimed by the claws of the unknown. Instead, the hunter's fire ignited within me, cutting through the cold grip of panic. Mrs. Parker grabbed my arm, her fingers digging crescent moons into my skin. "Jonah, what are we going to do?" Her voice, trembling and cracked with fear, steadied me. We. I wasn't alone. "Listen," I snapped, eyes darting over the nightmarish scene. The fire had spread, a few of the smaller cottages now burning alongside the general store. Townsfolk fled in every direction, their terror fueling the creature's bloodlust. We needed a plan, however desperate. "Can you make it back home?" My voice was clipped, fighting to be heard above the din. Mrs. Parker stared at me, confusion warring with the stark terror in her eyes. Then a flicker of something like steely resolve crossed her face. "Yes," she whispered. I think so." I gripped her shoulder, squeezing tight enough to leave a bruise, but she didn't flinch. "Take any children you find with you, anyone too scared or slow to help themselves. Go there, barricade, and wait. Do you understand?" A flicker of doubt, then she nodded, her jaw set. I released her, and she vanished back into the crowd. A woman I'd known as meek and gossipy was now a beacon of survival for the helpless. My gaze swept over the scene. Alderman Shaw was a lost cause, still shouting and firing his musket. The fire gave his wild eyes a manic sheen, and his voice had cracked with a hysteria that promised he'd turn his weapon on the townsfolk as soon as the monsters. The rest were a blur of terrified faces. Women, men, the elderly, and even a few children who'd fled the safety of their beds. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and rapidly crumbling under the weight of terror. But I wouldn't run. My flintlock had been lost in the scuffle at Henderson's cabin, but there had to be something. Then I saw it. An axe abandoned in the dirt next to a pile of firewood. Not meant for a beast like this, but a weapon nonetheless. I snatched it up, the heft reassuring. A shadow moved across the street. Too fast, too quiet. I turned to see a monstrous shape looming out of the smoke, drawn to the carnage. Yellow eyes gleamed, and bloody claws the length of my forearm scraped along the cobblestones, leaving deep gouges. It tilted its head, studying me with a chilling awareness. The axe felt heavy in my hand, puny against the creature's monstrous form. But I stood my ground, fueled by an anger almost as strong as the fear coiling in my gut. It snarled, saliva dripping in silver strings from its fanged maw, then lunged. I roared, pure sound of desperate rage, and swung the axe. It struck, not with the clean slice I'd intended, but a glancing blow. The beast yelped, recoiling with surprise more than pain. Yellow eyes flared with a rage mirroring my own. It lunged again. This time, I dodged. Muscle memory honed from years in the woods kicked in. The axe head scraped the cobblestones as I twisted, the beast whipping past too close, the stench of it overpowering. The fight was a blur of snarls, dust, and flashing claws in the dim firelight. I'd swung the axe again, another clumsy blow that found only fur. But it served its purpose. I wasn't prey anymore. I was something to be wary of. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flash of movement. Tom Ellis, dragging himself across the ground, away from the chaos. His leg was a twisted, bloody mess, but his eyes held a stubborn flicker of defiance. Jonah. His voice was hoarse with pain and barely audible. Before I could react, the beast changed targets. With a snarl of frustration, it turned towards Tom, moving with that impossible speed. A primal scream tore from my throat. I didn't think, just ran, the axe raised high. The creature didn't even pause, leaping clean over Tom. But it hesitated just long enough, its yellow eyes fixing on me again. I was the threat now, not the injured boy. And for that one precious moment, Tom Ellis was forgotten. He scrambled away, dragging himself towards the nearest shelter as I stood alone in the center of the burning square, the beast and I locked in a battle of wills. A tense truce filled the smoky air, broken only by the ragged rasp of my breathing and the crackling of the flames. I stood, feet planted in the blood-soaked dust of what was once the town square, axe held high. Across from me crouched the monster, a shadow born of nightmare given grotesque form. Yellow eyes narrowed, tracking my every move with a hunter's precision. For those heart-stopping moments, it was the two of us against the world, locked in a deadly dance. The firelight flickered across its hulking form, highlighting the thick matted fur, the unnatural stretch of its limbs, and the wicked claws that could tear a man to ribbons. I had wounded it, drawn a drop of blood, but it hadn't fled. Not yet. The creature was assessing me, weighing the risk of continuing this fight. Was the effort worth the potential reward of a meal, however meager, or was I too dangerous now? In its chilling gaze, I saw not just ravenous hunger, but something like cunning. My grip on the axe tightened, the handle slick with fear sweat. I could smell its foul breath, a stench of rot and raw meat. The beast tilted its massive head, and I couldn't help but see in it a chilling reflection of myself, a creature backed into a corner, forced to fight for survival. Suddenly, another growl arose, this one deeper, echoing from the direction of the woods. The creature before me tensed, its yellow eyes flicking towards the sound. Then, from the engulfing darkness, a second monstrous shape emerged. My heart plummeted. The odds that were barely against me were now insurmountable. The newcomers were a matched pair, monstrous twins of the first. They stalked towards us with an eerie confidence, flanking their wounded packmate. Panic flared inside me, hot and destructive. "Run," a primal voice whispered. But where? My home was too far, too exposed, and the way back towards the woods was cut off by the monsters. This town square, this burning ruin, was my corner. I wouldn't leave it without a fight. The lead creature, the one I'd injured, tested its weight on its bloodied leg, a snarl curling its lips. Then it turned towards me and lunged. But I wasn't standing alone anymore. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a blur of movement. Cooper Ben, the old windbag, emerged from a side street wielding his own axe. Fear had drained the usual ruddy color from his face, and his hands shook, but his eyes burned with a desperation that mirrored my own. "Take the left one, Mason," he roared, his voice cracking but loud enough for a moment. I didn't question his sudden bravery, didn't question the fate that had pitched us together in this desperate stand. I lunged, meeting the beast's charge. Its wounded leg slowed it down, just slightly, and I managed to deflect a clawing paw with the axe head. A heartbeat later, I heard Ben's agonized cry. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him stagger back, blood blossoming across his chest. The creature he'd faced had landed a blow, a fatal one by the looks of it. Ben collapsed, the axe tumbling from his hands. His sacrifice had bought me a few precious moments. The creature before me, smelling the blood of its fallen packmate, let out a roar. It turned away, leaving me momentarily forgotten as it lunged for Ben's crumpled body. Rage, fueled by desperation, surged through me. I raised my axe and screamed a wordless challenge. The creature paused, then whipped its massive head back in my direction, yellow eyes aflame. Then it was upon me. I parried the first blow, but the force of its attack sent vibrations up my arms, threatening to knock the axe free. The stench washed over me, nearly gagging me with its intensity. Somehow, I managed to twist, the creature's claws tearing through my jacket, leaving burning lines of pain on my ribs. I stumbled, struggling to regain my footing. Before I could, the beast was there again. I threw up the axe in a desperate block, a clash of metal and teeth and bone. I felt the impact reverberate through my body, and a sickening crack sounded above the roar of the flames. Agony flared in my arm, a white-hot wave of pain. The axe, I realized with horror, was gone. It had shattered under the force of the blow, the remnants sent skittering across the cobblestones. I was defenseless, the realization settling over me like a shroud. Across the square, the third beast feasted on Cooper Ben's remains, oblivious for the moment of my plight. I was done. The hunted become prey in the blink of an eye. Then, as the beast loomed above me, ready to deliver the killing blow, a flicker of movement behind it caught my eye. A figure, small and frail-looking, launched itself out of the darkness. It was Mrs. Parker. The woman I'd seen only as timid now wielded a fireplace poker like a sword, charging the distracted monster from behind. The world exploded into a chaotic blur. Mrs. Parker's scream of defiance, the startled snarl from the monstrous creature, the rush of adrenaline through my veins. It all mingled in a whirlwind of sound and fury. My own legs reacted before my brain gave permission. I lunged, a desperate gamble rather than a calculated maneuver. I tackled the beast, not from the front, but the side where I'd injured it before. Its snarl shifted into a pained yelp as I threw my full weight onto the wounded leg. We rolled in a tangle of limbs and dirt, my ragged breaths mingling with the beast's furious growls. Its claws raked, tearing strips from my already ragged clothing, digging bloody furrows on my back. Yet, the pain fueled me. It was evidence that I was still alive. The beast thrashed and twisted, trying to throw me off its back, but for a few desperate seconds, I held on. Its injured leg hampered its movement, hindering its attempts to dislodge me. Then, With a sickening lurch, the creature regained its footing. I was flung off, tumbling across the cobblestones. I scrambled to my feet, searching frantically for any sort of weapon. The remaining beast was occupied, Mrs. Parker valiantly poking at it with her poker. She was no match for its fury, but her bravery had earned me time. Then I saw it. The remnants of my shattered axe, the broken handle half buried in the dirt. With a ragged cry, I scooped up the makeshift weapon. The snarling beast, its hunger rekindled, abandoned Mrs. Parker and turned towards me. Its yellow eyes blazed like infernal fires, promising pain and death. We circled each other, predator and prey sizing each other up one final time. I knew this might be my last stand. My ribs ached, my breath came in harsh gasps, and every inch of my skin screamed with pain. The broken axe felt like a child's toy in my hand, but somewhere, deep within the terror and exhaustion, I felt a flicker of defiance. It wasn't acceptance, not resignation. It was the ember of rage that had sparked the night these beasts crashed into our world. The determination to survive, to protect. The creature lunged. I met its charge head-on, not with the skill of a swordsman, but with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. Yellow eyes widened with something like surprise as I twisted at the last second, avoiding its claws. My makeshift weapon lashed out, striking the beast across the muzzle. It was little more than a glancing blow, but it drew a yelp and bought me another precious moment. We clashed again and again. The cobblestone square was slick with sweat and blood. I wasn't sure whose, but somewhere in the frenzy, a shift occurred. The beast, despite its size and strength, started to falter. Each dodge, each parry took its toll, and I sensed its growing frustration in the snarls that deepened into ragged gasps. Then, a glimmer of hope. Mrs. Parker was still standing, wounded, terrified, but alive. And from across the square, I saw Tom Ellis struggling to his feet. In his hand was Cooper Ben's musket, the one weapon that might just turn the tide. "Tom!" I roared, my voice hoarse and strained. "Behind it!" Understanding dawned in his eyes, his fear replaced with desperate determination. He limped, half dragging himself, circling around the thrashing melee. I redoubled my own efforts, a frantic whirlwind of blows, not aiming to kill, but to distract, to buy time. The creature finally caught on, sensing the danger. It snarled and twisted, trying to snap at Tom, but my relentless assault gave it no respite. With a final lunge, I threw myself onto its back, clinging on as it bucked and twisted. The yellow eyes were filled with fury, and its claws ripped at me, but I held my ground. The musket roared. A hot wave of pain washed over my side. I screamed, more from surprise than agony. The creature beneath me thrashed violently, then went eerily still. My vision blurred, the world tilting precariously. I clambered off the twitching body, collapsing onto the cobblestone. Mrs. Parker knelt beside me, her hands pressing desperately against the wound in my side. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, I saw Tom Ellis standing over the downed beast, the musket pointed at the remaining one who was now cowering, its gaze darting between the dead bodies of its packmates and the battered humans before it. It snarled, its eyes blazing in the dim light, but it was the snarl of a cornered beast. Then, with a final glare that promised retribution, it turned and vanished into the darkness. Dawn washed over the ravaged settlement in cold gray light, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The air hung heavy with the stench of burnt wood, blood, and the lingering fear that clung to the shadows. I lay in my makeshift bed, my own cot dragged to Mrs. Parker's hearth, my injured side throbbing in time with my ragged pulse. Mrs. Parker, miracle of resilience that she was, tended tirelessly to the wounded. There were fewer than I dared hope at first glance, but enough to break my heart nonetheless. Tom Ellis survived, though his leg would never be the same. Alderman Shaw was gone, his fate a bloody stain in the dust of what was once the town square. Many others I knew by name, by passing conversation, were absent in the hushed voices and vacant stares of those who remained. Yet the town endured. Not in its prior form. The naive sense of safety we'd taken for granted was irrevocably shattered. The survivors were ragged, wounded, but the same terror that had driven some into the waiting woods had forged a brittle sort of unity in those who stayed. By the third day, they came to me, not as townsfolk to a hunter, but as survivors seeking a leader. There was desperation in their eyes, a plea for some sort of direction in the face of the monstrous unknown that lurked beyond our shattered borders. And, surprisingly, there was respect. Respect born not from admiration, but from the grim acknowledgement that I had seen the beasts up close, had spilled their blood, and had somehow lived. I looked out at them. Mary Ellis, clutching her fatherless children, weathered old Sam from the outlying farm with the bandage wrapped tight around his arm, even Mrs. Parker, her usual frailty replaced by a quiet strength. They were battered, yes, but they were there, and I owed them my all, no matter how inadequate that may feel. My gaze settled on the woods at the settlement's edge. In those depths, I knew, more beasts lurked. I knew also that vengeance, while tempting, was a hunter's folly. There was no satisfaction in the death of those three, only a deeper understanding of the danger. There would be more, and when they came, we had to be ready. "We have to learn," I said, my voice raspy and weak, but carrying across the stillness. "We learn their tracks, their patterns. We learn what hurts them, how to fight them off." My words wouldn't erase their fear, wouldn't mend broken lives, or soothe the gaping wound left in the heart of our town. But I saw something kindle in their eyes, a flicker of steel beneath the ashes. For the first time since the night of fire, I felt a sliver of something like hope. We would survive this, we would endure, and maybe, just maybe, someday we'd even be able to fight back. Not for revenge, but for a future worth clinging to. Because out here on the Borderlands, on the edge of the encroaching darkness, the only way forward was to walk into the teeth of the unknown together.